We're now going to look at an extremely interesting concept, which is the concept of 3 lines of defense model. This is an example, an actual real example from a bank. It's, I put in graphical form. You can see that there are a certain number of front office functions, such as, corporate banking and treasury. You can see that there are some so-called back office functions and support functions, operations, HR, administration, IT, accounting, legal, and finance. And then you would have some control functions. So in a bank, it's very clear. I'm going to say it's roughly clear what is a second and first line of defense function, such as compliance and risk management. If you look at the bar in the middle, which goes from red in first line of defense to blue in second line of defense, I put a gradient. Now, there are some functions which are really second line of defense in this model, and I'm going to explain exactly what that means, but you have to understand that we can also analyze this on a risk basis, and we will through assurance mapping, and that you can have some so-called second line of defense functions doing first line of defense controls. That's not always good, but sometimes okay. Or first line of defense functions doing second line of defense controls, such as an accounting function can review the operations from, the operations department. Let me explain a bit what that means. So in a bank, you have your treasury making, a treasury operation. It goes through an operations back office department for processing and will be put in the accounting by an accounting function. But that accounting function, technically a first line of defense function, could also review the operations, produced by Treasury and Operations Department. So they are acting for this particular risk as a second line of defense function. Remember that a first line of defense function are the risk owners. They are the ones that are directly accountable for a risk. A second line of defense function isn't directly accountable, but tries to make sure that the first line of defense function has properly covered the risk. And indeed, if there are many different actors on the first line of defense, then there might be sort of an aggregation of data by the second line of defense. So a risk management function in a bank looks at sort of the corporate banking and treasury operations for their market risk, for their credit risk, for their exposure to capital markets. And they're going to try to understand overall, the different exposures that the bank would have to risks. They're really acting as a second line of defense. They're not, performing the trading operations like Treasury is, but they're reviewing the data separately. Same thing for our compliance. They're looking at, in theory, all different departments to see whether all different departments are compliant with laws. But they are not technically risk owners, even for compliance matters. And then in this model, you have third line of defense. That's typically internal audit. We placed external audit there as well, and the different dotted line and functional reporting line to the audit committee and dotted reporting line to senior management. Now we're going to see how this works. So responsibilities in the 3 lines of defense model. The first line of defense, the functions that manage risk and are risk owners. I placed them there. They have the responsibility for implementing and maintaining effective risk management. The second line of defense, functions that oversee and provide control over risks. They assist with risk identification and analysis, they aggregate data, and they help on reporting, one or two levels up. For instance, risk management is the one determining so-called tactical risk tolerances. They're taking the information on risk appetite from the board and really breaking it down to particular risks and what our tolerance and ability to weather risks are at a very granular individual level for different risks. The third line of defense, we oversee everything. Now, when we're looking at second line of defense, we are trying to understand, again, we had a whole chapter about this, whether we can rely on our second line of defense. When we're looking at first line of defense, well, first of all, we often get our information from the second line of defense, who's actually reviewing that function. But we are looking at first line of defense directly as risk owners. And so we know that they are directly accountable for the risks that are there. In addition to that, we have the board, who's the ultimate party accountable for risk management. And very technically, well, they're accountable for everything, including the risks and the negative consequences themselves. They establish the risk management governance, and they determine the risk appetite. It's very important that the risk appetite be determined at a level which is sufficiently high, and by the people who really should care about how risky they want their portfolio of shareholdings in the company to be. Again, this is not only about financial factors. They might say, we really do not want to have any, social, environmental risks in addition to economic risks. Senior management, they have the responsibility for achieving the goals and objectives of the organization, and they manage the different risks to achieve this. They're the ones actually putting the things in place, and they are accountable for the risks at their level. They are both, you should understand, first line of defense and second line of defense. And you have to understand on the exam, when you have exercises for classifying risks, you often have questions saying, is management, are you going to slot them in first line of defense? Are you going to slot them in second line of defense? You have to understand that management can both be the ones taking certain risks and being accountable for them, as well as working as a verifier of the work of others. So if you've heard of, for example, the so-called 4-eye control, that means you have a second person reviewing the work of another. In a 4-eye control, if this is performed by management, then they would be second line of defense. You have potential external assurance providers. The most known of these is external audit. I just want to say that I've given you a pretty rigid model up to now, but you have to understand that this is not necessarily best practice. It's not necessarily bad practice either. There are different opinions, there are different best practices about how to go about. But some of the variations which can exist include the board may include members of senior management. So often you have independent, also called non-executive directors on the board. I think best practice is at least 50% of a board should be non-executive directors. I just want to clarify that in a group, you can have local subsidiaries with boards. However, when you have someone from group level sitting on a local subsidiary, then technically that director at the level of the local subsidiary is considered an independent non-executive director. So one of the variations is, a higher or lower percentage of senior management or executive directors on the board. The second thing is that the board may be more or less involved in the operations in smaller organizations which still have a board structure, or indeed where you have board members, shareholders, which are still extremely active in the organization. I've worked for, some where indeed the initial founders of the organization were still in the organization when it had, covered 50 countries or more, but were still directly involved. I had meetings every single 2 weeks with one of the shareholders, initial founders of the organization. And so obviously this was a model where this particular shareholder wanted to be very involved in the operations and really understand them very, very well. And so it can be more or less delegated. We can have strategic planning directed by the board, or it can be more, senior management taking care of this aspect of the work. And there might be a separation of the first and second line of defense. It might be strict, or it might need to be blended. Blended is kind of a mix of both. I'll give you an example, again, from this bank in this chart that I show you right down there. In this bank, you would have a corporate banking function. In strict banking practice, your corporate banking department should have absolutely all client-facing contact. The compliance department oversees corporate banking, but it is strictly enforced, at least it should be strictly enforced, that the compliance department should not have contact with clients. This is a case where it would be absolutely strict that there would be a separation. There are other cases where you might have, say, accounting overseeing the operations of operations, where indeed it might be more of a collaboration at certain points. Now again, they're both first line of defense functions, but there might be a bit more of a collaboration rather than one acting strictly as first line and the other strictly as second line. If there is less separation, then internal audit might be able to rely less on the function for internal assurance. And so this is a good thing to know, that if the separation from first line and second line of defense is not strict enough, then there could be problems of familiarity, there might be some conflicts of interest, there might be some ownership of risks by functions considered to be second line of defense.